My name is Adriano, and the story I'm bringing to you today is not something that happened to me directly, but it is one of the most terrifying and inexplicable accounts I have ever heard. It happened to one of my closest friends, a fellow road driver named Luciano. He gave me full permission to share every single detail of what went down that night, and honestly, we genuinely need to hear what you all think about what he encountered out there in the dark, because I'm telling you right now, there is no rational explanation for what he saw, and by the time this video is over, you're going to understand exactly why. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and smash that like button. Stories like this one only reach more people when you show your support. Now let's get into it. Luciano was born and raised deep in the interior of Bahia, a man hardened by years of a difficult life, someone who had spent the better part of his adult years behind the wheel of a long-haul bus, running routes that cut across the entire state, transporting people from every corner of that land. He was not the kind of man who scared easily. He was built for the road, physically, mentally, emotionally. And yet, what happened to him on that particular night shattered every ounce of that toughness. As is all too common in the exhausting routine of our profession, this nightmare unfolded during a graveyard shift, what we in the business call a corujão, that brutal overnight run that demands twice the focus and 3 times the willpower. It was well past midnight during that dead hour when the entire world seems to hold its breath, when everything goes quiet in a way that almost feels unnatural. Luciano was navigating a particularly dangerous and desolate stretch of the BR-116, the infamous Rio Bahia highway, a road that many drivers respect and fear in equal measure. He was cutting through a stretch of sertão where you can drive for kilometers without seeing another living soul. Just the endless dark immensity of the Caatinga stretching out on both sides. For those who know the region near the town of Milagres, the landscape is defined by massive solid rock formations, bone-dry brush, and vegetation covered in thorns. In the harsh daylight of the northeastern sun, it carries a certain raw beauty, but at night, the entire scenery transforms into something else entirely. The shadows thrown by the headlights make those rock formations look like enormous creatures rising up from the earth, reaching out toward the road. They loom and shift and close in, and if you stare too long, your mind starts playing tricks that the darkness is more than happy to encourage. The highway that night was a carpet of pure darkness, not a single truck coming or going in either direction. The only light came from the pale glow of a high moon and the powerful beams of the bus cutting through the black ahead. Most of the passengers had long since surrendered to sleep, rocked into unconsciousness by the rhythm of the vehicle. The diesel engine kept its steady growl, the only sound breaking the absolute silence of the sertão outside. Luciano sat firm at the wheel, his mind already drifting ahead to arriving at the terminal, getting a hot shower to wash off the road dust, and lying down. A completely normal thought for a man doing a completely normal job. And then came the impact. Without any warning, a violent jolt tore through the entire chassis of the bus. This was not the subtle bump of a loose stone or a shallow pothole. This was a brutal, dry, bone-deep impact, the kind that sends a shockwave up through the steering column and into your hands. It felt like running over a large boulder, or like the rear axle dropping into one of those massive craters that open up on poorly maintained asphalt. The entire bus shuddered. Luciano's blood ran cold, not just from the force of the impact, but from what it could mean. Out on this road, it was well known that criminals would sometimes throw large rocks or logs across the pavement to force a bus to stop. Robbery was always a possibility on isolated stretches like this one. The most unsettling part was that the road ahead had looked completely clear in the headlights. There had been nothing there. Luciano reacted with the instincts of a veteran driver. He gripped the wheel with iron hands, applied the brakes with careful, measured pressure to avoid a rollover, and brought the bus under control. But whatever it was, the damage was done. He felt it clearly, the double rear wheels rolling over something substantial, something large enough to register through the entire suspension system. Heart hammering, mind spinning through worst-case scenarios, he steered the bus onto the dirt shoulder and brought it to a stop. He scanned both mirrors, searching for any movement coming from the tree line, any sign of armed men. Nothing. He then cycled through the possibilities in his head. Best case, he had hit a stray calf that broke through a fence, or maybe a large dog. Mechanical worst case, he had destroyed the rear suspension and was now stranded in the middle of absolutely nowhere. A sitting target. Either way, with a bus full of sleeping passengers depending on him, he had a responsibility to check. He grabbed the powerful handheld flashlight he always kept beside his seat, took a slow, deliberate breath, and opened the door. He descended the steps with that familiar cold dread settling in his stomach, eyes sweeping the darkness on both sides, half expecting figures to emerge from the brush. But what he found when he crouched down and swept the flashlight beam beneath the rear axle was something far worse than an ambush or a mechanical failure. What was under that bus defied every law of logic he had ever relied on. Lying in the dirt beneath the vehicle, moving slowly, seemingly stunned, was a creature. It was not. Shredded. There was no blood, no scattered remains, nothing that should exist beneath the chassis of a heavy bus that had just rolled over it at highway speed. And that impossibility alone was enough to make Luciano's rational mind start to crack. Luciano described the creature as something that had no category in his experience. It had the rough silhouette of a dog, but it was a diseased, wrong version of one. Grotesquely thin, reduced to nothing but leather and bone. The ribs were visible through the surface of its hide, each one clearly defined, as though the dull black skin had been vacuum-sealed directly onto the skeleton beneath. The fur, if it could be called that, had a matte, pitch-black quality that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, but the most sickening detail wasn't the emaciation. Along the creature's spine, running in a perfectly straight, horrifying line from the base of the tail all the way up to the nape of the neck, were bone spines. They jutted outward like some grotesque crest, not unlike a porcupine's quills, but wrong in their alignment, wrong in their uniformity. And at the tip of each spine there glistened a golden-colored secretion. A viscous, pulsating liquid that shimmered in the flashlight beam like something venomous, alive and deliberate. Beyond the visual horror, the smell was unbearable. The creature radiated a stench so powerful it was almost physical, a combination of wet dog and rotting carrion that had baked for days under a brutal sun. It hit Luciano in waves, making his throat tighten and his eyes water, and then the creature lifted its head. It did so in a mechanical, unnatural motion, slow and deliberate, the way something moves when it is choosing to be seen. And when its eyes locked onto Luciano, he swore on everything he held sacred that those were not the eyes of an animal. They were large, deep, and completely black. But behind that blackness was something unmistakably present. An intelligence, a calculating, malevolent awareness that was measuring him with total indifference to his fear. And those eyes glowed, a deep amber-yellow light pulsing from within them like twin embers burning in the dark. In that moment, a name surfaced in Luciano's mind without invitation. A legend that every long-haul driver has heard at some point, whispered at truck-stop rest areas, carried on late-night radio frequencies, passed between drivers the way warnings travel enclosed. Communities, the chupacabras, He cannot explain why the name came to him with such certainty, but standing there in the dirt of the BR-116, staring at what was writhing beneath his bus, he knew. That was what this was. Survival instinct detonated inside him. His legs went weak. He stumbled back a step, then broke into a run toward the bus door. And behind him, the creature responded. It let out a sound that was less of a growl and more of something that seemed to come up from the earth itself. A deep, grinding vocalization that didn't belong to any known animal. And then, defying every physical reality that should have applied to something that had just been run over by a loaded bus, the creature rose. It pushed itself upright, standing almost vertically on its hind legs, and began moving toward Luciano with a broken, angular gait. Joints flexing in the wrong directions, spine curled forward, but every movement loaded with singular focused aggression. Luciano didn't wait. He threw himself through the door, slammed the controls to seal it shut, and engaged the first gear with a hand shaking so badly he nearly missed the shift. The bus lurched forward on the gravel shoulder before catching the asphalt. The engine roared, and then the impacts started. Something was hitting the rear of the bus. Rhythmic, heavy strikes against the bodywork, the sound of something launching itself against the metal at high speed. In the vibrating rear-view mirror, Luciano could make out a black shape tracking the vehicle. It was running, leaping in frantic bursts, keeping pace with the bus accelerating through 80 kilometers per hour as though the speed meant absolutely nothing. The spines along its back blazed in the dark, the golden fluid flying off them in droplets that traced a luminescent trail across the asphalt, a glowing path left behind by something that should not exist. The creature made no sound as it ran, no barking, no snarling, just a terrible, focused silence. The silence of something that has located its prey and has no need to announce itself any further. Luciano floored it. He blew past every speed limit, ignored every radar trap, rode the road surface as hard as the chassis would allow. Passengers who had been jolted awake began shouting from the back, asking if it was a robbery, asking what was happening. He had no voice to answer them. There were no words adequate for what was chasing them through the dark. The chase lasted for minutes that stretched and compressed like a fever dream. And then the lights of a small town district appeared on the horizon, a cluster of amber street lamps, the faint glow of a gas station, the suggestion of civilization. As the bus crossed into the illuminated zone, Luciano finally eased his foot from the accelerator. He looked in the rearview mirror. The creature was gone. It had retreated. It dissolved back into the darkness of the Caatinga, back to wherever it came from, carrying its golden-tipped spines and its impossible vitality back into the deep sertão. The trauma, however, did not retreat with it. Luciano says he has never forgotten that vision, and he was not alone in what he witnessed. At the terminal, several passengers from the rear seats confirmed what had happened. They described the same creature, skeletal, black, shining spines racing alongside the bus in the dark. Every single one of them crossed themselves while speaking, and every single one agreed, without hesitation, that what they had seen could only be the chupacabras, or something even worse that doesn't yet have a name. Luciano says that in the Bahia Sertão, the old people have always spoken of these things, of werewolves, of road spirits, of entities that belong to the space between the living world and whatever lies beyond it. After that night, he says he doubts nothing anymore, whether it was a cursed soul trapped between worlds or the living embodiment of a legend that predates memory. What he encountered on the BR-116 was real, and it is still out there. My name is Fabiano, and what I'm about to tell you is not a story to pass the time. This is, without any shadow of a doubt, the most terrifying experience of my entire life. And I've been driving buses for over 15 years. If you've spent any real time behind the wheel, you know that the road teaches you things that no classroom ever could. You develop a relationship with the asphalt that goes beyond technique. A sixth sense, almost. You learn to read the road not just with your eyes, but with your gut. Not the kind of feeling that comes from engine noise or tire pressure. I'm talking about that deep, visceral alarm signal that fires when something is wrong in a way that your conscious mind hasn't yet processed. That twist in the stomach that tells you what your eyes are seeing is not from this world. What happened to me one night on a remote road in northern Minas Gerais still makes my entire body run cold every time. I let myself remember it. And I will tell you this right now. There is a specific stretch of that highway where I no longer drive, not for any amount of money, not under any circumstances. What I saw there left a mark on me that no amount of time has fully erased. It all started during a night run on one of those local routes that cuts through the interior. For privacy reasons, I won't name the exact line, but it ran through that isolated region of northern Minas, close to the state border. One of those stop every few kilometers routes that the locals call a linha economica, picking up and dropping off ordinary working people at villages that most maps don't bother to show. The road was long, draining, and wrapped in absolute silence. The pavement was old and riddled with potholes that blended into stretches of raw, packed earth. The surrounding landscape was all high sierras, dry cerrado vegetation, and straight roads that seemed to extend forever, with not a single streetlight for kilometers in any direction. Total darkness. It was past 2 in the morning. I remember that clearly. My passengers were almost all asleep, collapsed back in their seats. I was up front, the cabin barely lit by the instrument panel, the road swallowing my high beams. The atmosphere felt heavy that night, tense in a way I couldn't explain, but up to that point, everything appeared normal. And then, at the edge of my high beam range, another bus appeared. My first instinct was mild suspicion. It wasn't common to encounter another bus out there at that hour, on that stretch. I told myself it was probably one of those old unofficial transport vehicles, running clandestine routes with questionable permits. But the more I looked, the stranger it became. I know every paint scheme of every company that operates in that region. I've memorized their liveries the way you memorize faces. But no matter how hard I stared at that bus, I could not identify it. No logo, no route number, no company, colors I recognized. Then there was the state of the vehicle itself. It looked destroyed. The bodywork was heavily oxidized, the metal surface dull and eaten through in places, the overall appearance of something that should have been decommissioned years ago. And then the second thing hit me, the thing that sent the first real wave of unease crawling up my spine. The bus had no lights on. Not a single one. No tail lights, no headlamps, no interior glow. It was moving through absolute darkness, as a silhouette, a massive shadow of metal cutting through the black, as if the driver navigating it had no need whatsoever to see the road ahead. I kept a careful distance, watching that dark shape with growing unease, when I began to notice the way it moved through corners. On the mountain curves, where any responsible driver will brake hard, downshift, respect the physics of a loaded vehicle on a narrow road, that bus did not slow down once. It sailed through every bend at unbroken speed, almost level with the road surface, as if the laws of gravity and centrifugal force simply did not apply to it. We continued like that for several kilometers. Then, on a long straight stretch, something happened that broke through every remaining skepticism I had left. I had been deliberately hanging back, some instinct warning me not to get closer. And from that distance, I watched the dark bus brake, with no prior warning, no deceleration build-up, and stop in the middle of the road. Not at a bus shelter, not near any structure, not anywhere a human being should have been waiting, just bare roadside, deep scrub and darkness. And yet the door opened, and something boarded. I saw the movement. I saw the shadow of a figure stepping up into that bus and disappearing inside. Minutes later, it happened again. Only this time in reverse. A figure descended and was swallowed by the darkness of the roadside bush. People getting on and off in the absolute middle of nowhere. When I saw that, I was convinced I was losing my mind. I told myself it was exhaustion, that the night was playing with my perception. But I knew, in the part of my mind that doesn't lie to itself, that what I was watching was real. And that's exactly why I made the decision, out of some stubborn need to confirm what I was seeing, to close the distance. I pressed the accelerator down. My engine responded immediately, building revs, but no matter how hard I pushed, the gap between my bus and that dark shape did not shrink. It was as if the distance was calibrated, as if that bus knew precisely how close I was trying to get and was adjusting to prevent it. At one point, it even appeared to slow slightly, letting me pull almost close enough to read the plate, before accelerating again and pulling away smoothly, effortlessly, as though mocking me. Numero The realization. A cold descended through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I ran the math in my head, the speed I was traveling, the time that had elapsed, the distance covered. Nothing about that bus should still have been ahead of me. It should have been kilometers behind. I stared at the instrument panel, checked the speedometer, looked back at the road, and there it was, still floating ahead of me, silent, dark, waiting. And that's when the legend crept back in. The one I had always dismissed as campfire exaggeration, the kind of story older drivers tell to keep younger ones awake during overnight hauls. The phantom bus, the vehicle that appears to lone drivers on isolated roads and lures them into matching its pace through mountain curves until the driver, convinced they're chasing something real, follows it into a fatal mistake. I swallowed hard. My hands were soaked against the steering wheel. Every part of me wanted to shout for help, to wake one of my passengers, to have another witness. But I couldn't risk triggering a panic in the cabin. I had to manage this alone. Numero dos. The disappearance. As the first lights of a small town appeared far ahead on the horizon, I watched the dark bus accelerate. It surged forward with sudden urgency, and then, a few kilometers short of the town entrance, I watched it begin to disappear. Not pull off the road, not turn onto a sidetrack. It simply dissolved, first the rear, then the middle, then the front, fading out of existence the way smoke disperses in wind. I stopped my bus right there in the road. I sat with my hands on the wheel and stared out the windshield. I checked both sides. I scanned the roadside brush with my mirrors. There was no embankment it could have fallen down, no hidden turnoff, no dust trail. The road was empty. The bus was gone, erased from reality as cleanly as if it had never been there at all. I sat for a long time before I could start moving again. When I finally reached the town and pulled into the platform, I was shaking. Over the following weeks, I couldn't shake the image from my head. Eventually, I gathered the nerve to tell other drivers what I'd experienced, and it was during one of those conversations that a veteran from the region, a man who had spent 40 years on those roads, went quiet and told me what everyone in that area already knew, but avoided saying out loud. He told me that on that stretch of northern Minas many years ago, sometime in the 1980s, a Volvo bus lost its brakes on the mountain descent and went over the edge of a deep ravine. No survivors. Everyone on board perished in the wreckage. And according to those who know the road, that bus never stopped running. It got locked into an eternal route, still picking up, still dropping off, still running the curves at impossible speeds. But he made sure I understood one thing. That bus is not just a ghost. It is a trap. It appears specifically to lone drivers and begins to race ahead of them, pulling them forward. And those who can't resist the instinct to match its speed through those blind mountain bends, those drivers find the same end as the original passengers. I survived because fear kept me back. Not everyone has been that fortunate. Today, Whenever I see an unlit shape on a dark road, I don't accelerate. I pray. Because I know now that there are routes out there that don't lead to any destination in the living world. My name is Helena, and what I'm about to share did not happen to me. It happened to my father, Raimundo Nonato, a man who spent more than 20 years behind the wheel of a bus and knew every curve of every road he ever ran. But what he encountered one night on an isolated mountain road in the interior of Minas Gerais changed everything he thought he knew about fear. My father was exactly the type of seasoned driver people mean when they say an old hand of the road. He could navigate in pitch darkness by memory alone, identifying the location of every pothole, every bad shoulder, every blind curve by feel and experience. He was serious, grounded, never one for exaggeration or embellishment. When he decided to tell you something, you listened, because Raimundo Nonato did not waste words on fiction. This happened on a dirt road, deeply isolated. I cannot give you the precise location. I genuinely don't remember the exact point, but I know it was in one of those high Sierras, because he always referred to the dangerous curves. It was the kind of route that connected tiny scattered settlements and rural properties across wide, empty terrain. The sort of place where after a certain hour of the night, there isn't a soul on the road, and the vegetation closes in on both sides, until it feels like the forest is actively consuming the path ahead. My father said that particular night had a strange, suffocating stillness about it. It was well into the early hours of the morning. Most passengers had drifted off to sleep. The bus moved through the dark at a careful pace, and the full moon illuminated the dry grass hillsides with a pale, cold glow. But the temperature that night was wrong, not the familiar chill of the Minas Highlands. This was different, a cold that cut through fabric and settled directly into the bones, the heavy, electrically charged feeling of a storm that never arrives. Then the headlights of the bus swept across a figure at the edge of the road, standing near one of those improvised wooden bus shelters that appear near old farmsteads, barely visible in the dark. A woman. She raised her hand to signal. She wore a long dress, dark-colored, the fabric dusty and worn, the clothing of rural poverty. Her hair was loose and somewhat disheveled, falling over both shoulders. My father found it unusual to encounter a woman alone at that hour, in that place, but he also understood the realities of interior life. People traveled late when circumstances demanded it. His duty was to stop. The woman climbed the steps slowly. She paid her fare with small coins without a word of greeting. Not even a good evening. She moved past the turnstile and took a seat toward the back. For several minutes, everything appeared completely normal. The engine rumbled. The chassis rattled on the uneven ground. And then my father did what every long-haul driver does automatically, a routine check of the interior mirror to scan the passenger cabin. At first, he thought it was a bad reflection, a trick of the glass, a smear on the mirror surface, some odd angle of light coming through a window. He almost let it go, but something made him look again, made him really look, and when he did, his blood went cold. In the rearview mirror, beneath the hem of that long dark dress, he could see what should have been feet. They were not feet, they were hooves. Thick, coarse, dark-furred legs ending in hard, solid hooves, the legs of a large goat or a horse, planted firmly against the floor of the bus, completely still, completely real. My father gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. His first instinct was denial, exhaustion, hallucination, the road playing its games. To test himself, he turned his head and looked directly at the woman, bypassing the mirror entirely. And there were normal feet, old, simple shoes, human feet. He exhaled slowly, steadied his heart and looked back at the mirror. The hooves were there again. They had not moved. They did not attempt to hide. Those animal legs sat in the reflection with the calm, unwavering solidity of something that had no reason to conceal itself. as though the mirror was showing a truth that human eyes were designed not to process directly. And then the smell came. It arrived suddenly and completely. A heavy, choking stench of sulfur. Not engine fumes, not burning vegetation from roadside fires, something internal, emanating from within the vehicle itself, filling the forward cabin and making his throat tighten and his eyes begin to water. Several passengers stirred in discomfort without fully waking, seemingly held under by the smell itself, as though sedated by it. Numero tres, the passenger who wasn't human. My father began to pray, quietly, under his breath, lips barely moving, hands locked on the wheel, eyes forward. He knew, in a place beneath reasoning, in the oldest, deepest layer of his instincts, exactly what had stepped onto his bus. The old rural legends he had grown up hearing, the warnings the elders passed down about sulfur appearing from nowhere, about things that walked among the living, wearing human shapes. It all collapsed into a single, terrible certainty. He did not break. He did not confront it. He understood, without anyone having to tell him, that to challenge it directly would be to invite a catastrophe that he would not survive. The passenger rode in silence, watching the windshield, knowing exactly the terror she was causing. And my father drove, praying, sweating, keeping the bus moving, because movement was the only defense he had. When the first, distant lights of the next village became visible on the horizon, the woman stood. She walked to the front of the cabin, stopped beside the engine cowling, and announced, in a voice that was flat and dry, entirely without inflection, that she would be getting off here, in the middle of nowhere, in the dark, on a road with no structures, no stop, no reason for any living person to disembark. My father did not hesitate for a single second. He wanted that thing off his bus. He stopped and opened the door. As she descended, he heard it, not the soft fall of shoe soles on metal steps, but a hard, rhythmic impact. The dry crack of hooves on steel, step by step, descending like a horse on a staircase. On pure reflex, he looked down at her feet as she stepped onto the road. For just an instant, just long enough to be absolutely certain, the illusion slipped. He saw the dark, furred legs, the black hooves pressing into the dirt. She stopped before disappearing into the darkness. She turned, slowly, to face him, and she smiled. My father says it was not a human smile. It was too wide. It stretched far beyond the natural limits of a face, splitting her features from ear to ear in an expression that contained no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of something that had been seen and didn't care, as if to say, I know that you know, and there is nothing you can do about it. The moment she vanished into the brush, the sulfur smell disappeared instantly, as though a switch had been thrown. My father floored the accelerator and did not reduce speed until the village lights were all around him. He never took that route again after dark, and to this day, he swears that on that freezing Minas Gerais night, he did not give a ride to a lost woman. He gave a ride to something that does not belong to the world of the living. My name is Danilo. I've been driving long-haul buses for many years now, and I know the roads of the Northeast the way most people know the layout of their own homes. But there is a specific stretch heading out of the Bahia interior toward Salvador, where I learned, in the hardest possible way, that certain things in the darkness should never be stared at for too long. I've covered an enormous portion of the Northeastern Highway network over the course of my career. The route I used to run crossed the Sertão, starting from those dry, isolated interior cities and descending the mountain range all the way down to the state capital. If there is one, truth that years behind a wheel will burn into you permanently, it is this: the road keeps secrets, and it does not share them with those who aren't ready to receive them. This happened in 2019, a long overnight run the kind that consumes the entire night. To complete this route, you're obligated to pass through some genuinely remote state roads, cutting through the void, through low Caatinga scrubland, through dark lowlands, and those interminable flat straights where the monotony alone can put a driver to sleep if the mind isn't fully engaged. That night was beautiful, technically speaking. Full moon. The lunar light was so strong and clear that it painted the grey asphalt and the dry vegetation on both sides in a soft silver glow, almost bright enough to drive without high beams. The cabin was quiet. The air conditioning held its steady hum. Passengers were sleeping or staring out at the darkness, foreheads against cold glass. I was at the front, focused, calm, absorbing the rhythm of the road, until I reached the stretch that the older hands at the garage always mentioned in lowered voices. Numero 4, the travelling light. This region of the Bahia Sertão carries a legend, one that has been circulating among drivers for generations. The people of the area call it the luz viajante, the travelling light, a ball of fire or a concentrated glow that appears to those travelling alone in the early hours of the morning. According to everything I had heard at fuel stops and rest areas, this light is not a star, not a drone, not an aircraft. It materializes from nothing. It moves with apparent intention, approaching, retreating, hovering, and its purpose is singular and malevolent, to fracture the driver's concentration, to make a person lose their spatial orientation, to hypnotize. The legend is old, older than the road itself. It describes a light that floats low over the Caatinga, following travelers in silence, appearing stationary at first, but actively tracking its target, hunting. Some swore it had descended and pressed against windshields, blinding drivers entirely. Others said it kept its distance, just watching, one open eye burning in the dark. I had always filed it alongside every other campfire story, told to keep rookie drivers alert. I had passed that stretch hundreds of times and seen nothing but the occasional lizard crossing the road. That was before that night. I was at the critical point of the route when I caught a strange glow in my left side mirror, hovering low, approximately at window height, out over the scrubland. My first instinct was a cell tower or an isolated farmhouse with a powerful lamp. I kept driving. 5 minutes passed. I checked the mirror again. The light was in the exact same position relative to the bus, not further back, not closer. Precisely aligned, moving at the same speed I was moving, at somewhere between 80 and 90 kilometers per hour. I told myself it was an optical illusion. This full moon creates reflections on road signs and barbed wire fences that can fool you. I adjusted in my seat, rolled my neck, and kept my eyes forward. 10 minutes later, I looked again. It was still there, clamped to the side of the bus like it was tethered to the chassis by an invisible cord. The light had a yellowish pulsing quality, not steady like an electrical lamp, but rhythmic, breathing. At the distance I had been traveling, any fixed object on the roadside should have been kilometers behind me by that point. This did not fall behind. It did not advance. It held its position with a precision that no natural phenomenon could explain. The cold started in my legs and moved upward, not the air conditioning, the other kind of cold. I began calculating, checking the speed readout, checking the road ahead, looking at the light, running the numbers again. None of them worked in favor of a rational explanation. That light was attached to us, and it was watching. The legend rushed back, in full force. The part about hypnosis, about the light drawing a driver's eyes away from the road with increasing intensity until attention is entirely captured, and then the fatal error happens almost on its own. A slight drift, a missed curve, a head-on with an oncoming vehicle the driver never saw. The light doesn't cause accidents directly. It simply creates the conditions for them, patiently, persistently, with all the time in the world. I swallowed against a closed throat. My palms were slick against the wheel. Every instinct told me to wake a passenger, to have a witness, to not be alone with this. But I couldn't afford the panic. I had to stay composed. I had to protect everyone on board. The only thing I could think to do was pray. I started quietly, a Pai Nosso, an Ave Maria, the way my mother taught me when I was a boy. Barely audible, lips moving close to the glass of the instrument panel. I kept my eyes on the road and watched the light only through my peripheral vision, refusing to give it the full confrontation it seemed to be waiting for. It stayed, it pulsed, it kept pace. Numero cinco. 40 minutes, 40 minutes. I counted every one of them on the dashboard clock, because counting was the only thing keeping my mind from fracturing under the weight of what was happening. For 40 minutes, that light rode alongside us in the dark, and then, gradually, not all at once, but slowly, as though reluctant, it began to fall back. The glow dimmed by degrees, its rhythm slowing as if something inside it was winding down. It retreated toward the scrubland, shrinking back into the dark roots of the Caatinga, and disappeared. When the first lampposts of a small town broke the horizon and the bus crossed into an illuminated zone, I released a breath I had apparently been holding for the better part of an hour. The weight in my chest dissolved. The road was just a road again. At the final destination, after the last passenger stepped off and the platform cleared, I found two veteran drivers in the restroom nursing black coffee. I sat down and told them everything, still pale, voice unsteady. I expected laughter. I expected to be waved off as a man who had seen too many shadows. The silence I got instead was the heaviest silence I have ever experienced in a room. They looked at each other. Then one of them told me I should thank God I hadn't stopped the bus. They said they don't talk about it with newer drivers because they don't want to put fear in people before it's necessary. But that light had pulled colleagues off the road before. Drivers who had stared too long, who had been drawn in, who had pulled over to investigate. Drivers who didn't finish their routes. From that night forward, I no longer look at the darkness of the Caatinga the same way. And every time I pass through that stretch after nightfall, my eyes stay fixed on the asphalt. And I pray, steadily and sincerely, that I never see that amber glow riding alongside me through the rearview mirror again. My father spent more than 2 decades behind the wheel of a bus, and he always insisted that the overnight hours were the best time to work. Lighter traffic, roads that breathed, a rhythm he had mastered over years. But he learned the most terrifying lesson of his career during one of those same night runs, that it is precisely in the silence of these empty roads that certain things choose to reveal themselves. He had seen his share of strange incidents over the years, but none of them came close to what happened on one freezing winter night in 1998. He was running a scheduled route from Lagos to Porto Alegre, a full bus, maximum capacity, every seat taken. Ordinary passengers, workers, students, people making the journey to visit family. It was supposed to be a completely unremarkable trip. He had done it dozens of times. The heater ran quietly at minimum to keep the cold from reaching the passengers, and a radio played low in the cabin, just enough sound to keep his mind from settling into drowsiness on those long southern straights. Everything was running without incident until he passed through the area near Vacaria. That's when the radio crackled with a message from the dispatch center. A serious accident ahead had completely blocked the main highway. Traffic was at a standstill, no estimate on when the road would clear. He was given 2 options: wait it out on the main road, with all the delays and passenger complaints that implied, or take an alternate route through the interior, a secondary dirt road that would cut around the obstruction and reconnect with the main highway further ahead. He chose the detour without hesitation. Sitting still for an indeterminate amount of time was not something a man on a tight schedule could absorb. He steered the bus onto the secondary road and pushed forward. The alternate route was rough, deeply potholed, tree branches encroaching on both sides, curves poorly marked, the surface somewhere between packed dirt and broken gravel. Absolute darkness. But the road was completely empty at that hour, which gave him space to manage it carefully and at his own pace. He navigated most of the detour without incident, and by his own estimate was only about 20 minutes from rejoining the main highway when something ahead caught his attention. In the middle of that total darkness, in an open field with no structures, no road, no reason for fire, there was a bonfire burning, a large one, and gathered around it were women, numero seis, the ritual in the field. But the women were not alone. Standing among them, positioned around the fire with unsettling stillness, were creatures, large ones, black, horned, and standing upright on two legs, the way a human stands. That was the detail that broke everything. These things were not livestock that had wandered from a pen. They were not some trick of shadow and firelight. They stood erect with a deliberate posture, their bodies long and thin, their heads crowned with wide branching horns. And there was something in the quality of their presence, something in the energy radiating off that scene that reached through the windshield and told my father's nervous system in a language older than words that what he was looking at was not from this world. And then his headlights swept over the entire scene. Every figure, human and non-human alike, turned to look at the bus simultaneously. In that single second, my father felt the sensation of having been caught, of having seen something sealed and forbidden, something that no living person was intended to witness. The immediate, overwhelming instinct was to look back into the interior mirror and pray that no one in the front rows had woken up. The cabin was silent. No one appeared to have seen. The figures scattered instantly. The women dropped and ran on all fours, moving with a speed and fluidity that no normal human being possesses, covering the dark field like animals. The horned creatures moved on two legs, taking enormous ground-devouring strides that carried them into the mist and the tree line in seconds. They dispersed the way a gathering disperses when it senses exposure, with the urgent, coordinated retreat of something caught committing an act it cannot afford to have witnessed. My father did not need any additional information to understand what he had seen. The rural elders of the interior South had always spoken of these gatherings, of women who met in fields around fires in the deep of the night, surrendering themselves to dark forces in exchange for power. He had heard those stories as a boy and dismissed them as superstition. Standing on the edge of that field, with his hands white on the wheel and his heart slamming against his ribs, he was no longer in any position to dismiss anything. He buried the accelerator. The bus launched forward, hammering through the potholes, throwing passengers, awake with the violence of the acceleration. Someone from the middle seats shouted something. He couldn't be sure if they had seen the figures or were simply reacting to the sudden lurch. He didn't answer. He held the wheel with everything he had and kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. Numero seat. Looking back. But he made one mistake. As the bus put distance between itself and the field, my father looked into the rearview mirror. Through the dust and the vibration and the darkness, he saw the bonfire, and around it, slowly, unhurriedly, without any apparent concern for having been seen, the figures were returning. The women approached the flames again. The upright creatures drifted back from the tree line, and the ritual resumed, as though the bus had been nothing more than a passing annoyance, as though what they were doing was so firmly established, so deeply anchored in that place, that no witness could disrupt it. He did not look again. When he finally reached Porto Alegre and the last passengers stepped off the platform, he sat in the driver's seat for a long time without moving. He told no one that night. He filled out a maintenance form the next morning, citing suspension concerns, a pretext to have the vehicle thoroughly inspected, because something in him could not shake the feeling that the bus had passed through a contaminated place and needed to be cleaned of it. With time, and with the perspective that distance provides, my father has come to describe what he saw as exactly what the old accounts always called it, a real ritual, an authentic gathering of the kind that rural tradition has documented for centuries, conducted in secrecy in open fields, away from roads and settlements and the intrusion of the ordinary world. He stumbled into it by accident, an unforeseen consequence of a highway detour on a winter night in Rio Grande do Sul. He no longer takes alternate routes at night, and every time he is forced to pass through that area of the Serra Gaúcha, he keeps his speed down and his eyes forward. He always ends the story with the same sentence, and it has become something of a warning that I carry with me as well. The night was not made for wandering. The night is for looking straight ahead and nothing more. My name is Ernesto, and I need to share what happened to my father-in-law, an experienced bus driver who lived through a real nightmare on an isolated road. He dedicated his entire working life to the dirt routes of the interior, rising before dawn and returning after dark, day after decade. It was he who told me this story early in my relationship with his daughter, during one of those late evening porch conversations, where old accounts have a way of surfacing. I have never forgotten it, and every time I revisit it, the same cold settles in me. My father-in-law was one of the old-school bus drivers, strong arms, iron constitution, running the difficult and isolated routes that connected the settlements buried deep in the Bahia Sertão, navigating long stretches of beaten red dirt road. He did that for more than 30 years. He knew every curve, every cattle grid, every shadow of that Caatinga region. He recently retired, and thank God for that. To understand the full weight of what happened, you need to go back to 2013. The setting was one of those forgotten red dirt roads, dusty and remote, connecting nothing to nowhere. That particular night, my father-in-law was making the return trip. The bus was nearly empty, a handful of exhausted farm workers sleeping in the back, swaying with every rut in the road. It was late, closing in on 11 at night, and it was the last run of the day. Anyone who missed this bus would be stranded in that wilderness until morning. He had worked that route for over a decade. He drove it automatically, the way you navigate familiar rooms in the dark. No thought required, just muscle memory and the sound of the engine. The sky over the Sertão that night was immaculate. A massive, brilliant full moon lighting up the pale dust of the road and casting long shadows through the Mandacaru cacti. The only sounds were the diesel engine and the distant pulse of crickets in the dry scrub. A deceptive peace. He was watching the road for axle-breaking potholes when a shadow exploded out of the roadside brush directly into the path of the bus. It happened with a violence and speed that left no time for reaction. The shape was human in form, but moved with a terrible wrongness, too fast, too angular, the movement of something that was not functioning the way a body should function. Reflex took over. He hammered the brakes with full force. The tires dragged across the dirt, throwing up a wall of dust, but the distance was nothing. There was no time. The impact hit like a body striking a wall, a single, dense, terrible sound, and the bus shuddered. The passengers in the back muttered and shifted, interpreting it as another pothole. My father-in-law checked the interior mirror and saw no panic. Then, hands shaking in a way he had never experienced before, he set the parking brake, climbed down with his flashlight, and walked to the front of the bus to confront what he had hit. It was a man, an elderly man, white hair, completely unkempt, extremely thin, ribs visible through the skin, no clothing whatsoever. The body lay sprawled in the red dirt, absolutely still, covered in a dark crust of earth and old wounds, as though the man had been living on the ground for a very long time, sleeping in the soil like an animal. And the detail that made my father-in-law step backward: the man's back was cross-hatched with scars, not ordinary scars, deep, deliberate-looking lacerations, the kind left by something with enormous claws, dragged across sunburned skin with force. He crouched and checked for a pulse, for breathing. Nothing. The man's eyes were open, fixed on the stars above him, the mouth slightly ajar in an empty expression. He was gone. Numero oito. The dead man who ran. And here is where my father-in-law made the decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He was in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal, with a family depending on him, with a complicated relationship between rural communities and law enforcement that he had witnessed his entire life. The panic of an innocent man facing an unjust accusation overwhelmed him. He returned to the bus, started the engine, and drove away. He left the body on the road, and he asked God for forgiveness as the headlights receded and the darkness closed back over the man in the dirt. He drove for about 15 minutes, putting distance between himself and the scene, trying to regulate his breathing and quiet the roaring in his chest. And then something shifted in the air of the cabin, a pressure, the distinct and unambiguous sensation of a presence behind him, as though someone had settled into the space directly at his back. He looked in the interior, rearview mirror. Nothing. He checked the large exterior mirrors. The road behind him was dark and empty. But then, at the far edge of the rear light's reach, something appeared. A shape on the road, coming fast, very fast, faster than anything that ran on 4 legs, faster than anything that operated by the normal rules of biology and endurance. He accelerated. The shape closed the distance, as though his increase in speed meant nothing. When the red wash of his brake lights illuminated the road, fully my father-in-law saw what was running after him. It was the old man, the same gaunt frame, the same filthy skin, the same white hair. But this was no longer a corpse. It ran with its arms thrown back and its torso pitched forward, nearly horizontal to the ground, moving on 2 legs at a speed that outpaced the bus as he watched. And the eyes that had been fixed and empty and aimed at the sky, burned now with the deep orange glow of hot coals, living fire behind dead sockets. My father-in-law screamed. He punched the steering wheel. He floored the accelerator. He took a blind curve on the mountain road at a speed that nearly sent the bus over the edge. He didn't care. Every molecule of his body was in pure flight response. The passengers in the back were jolted violently awake and began shouting, but he had no voice left to explain what was running behind them through the dark. On a sharp bend, he pushed the throttle to its absolute limit. The rear wheels broke, loose in the loose dirt. The bus swayed. And when he finally gathered enough nerve to look in the mirror again, the road was empty. Whatever it was had stopped, or returned to wherever it had come from, or was waiting somewhere in the dark Caatinga for the next vehicle to pass through alone. He drove the remainder of the route in a silence that he describes as the heaviest silence of his life. When he reached the end terminal, he sat in the parked bus until his hands stopped shaking. He didn't. I'll tell anyone that night. He didn't tell anyone for days. When he finally did, it was to a group of older sertanejos, men and women who had lived their entire lives alongside the legends of that land. They listened without mockery. And then one of the elders told him something that, in a horrible way, made sense of everything. They said that what he had hit was not an ordinary man. They said it was a corpo seco, a dry body, a soul so thoroughly saturated with cruelty and sin during its lifetime that at the moment of passing, neither God nor the devil would accept it. Rejected by both sides of the divide, The earth itself eventually expels it, casts it back upward, and releases it to wander, ageless and furious, causing harm to the living out of an endless, purposeless malice. It cannot rest. It cannot move on. It exists only to rage against the world that no longer has a place for it. The nightmares lasted for months. He sought out a local healer, a traditional prayer woman, known in those communities, who performed a series of cleansing rituals, administered herbal baths, and worked to remove what she identified as a spiritual attachment that had latched on during the encounter. After that, the nightmares faded. The sensations in the night stopped. The feeling of being followed on empty roads gradually lifted. But the fear, he says, never fully left. He will tell you, crossing himself slowly as he says it, that the impact on that red dirt road didn't destroy that creature. The collision only served to wake it up with more rage than it had carried before. And somewhere out there in the Bahia Sertão, he believes, it is still moving, still waiting at the edge of the brush, still watching for the next driver who passes through alone after dark, in that dead hour when the world goes quiet and the road belongs to things that have no business being on it. My father-in-law drove that route for 3 more years after what happened, because a man with a family to feed does what he must, but he never again made that last run of the day without his rosary wrapped around his right hand on the gear shift. And not once, in all those remaining years, did he stop for anything on the side of that road. Not a fallen branch, not a stray animal, not a figure waving for help in the dark, because he had learned what some lessons cost, and he was not willing to pay that price twice. These are the roads that built us, the men and women who gave their lives to the wheel, who crossed this country in the dark so that others could arrive safely in the light. And these are the stories they carry, deep in their bones, in the part of memory that never fully heals. Not every danger on the highway has a logical explanation. Not every shadow in the rearview mirror belongs to the living world. If tonight you find yourself on an empty road, long after midnight, and something appears at the edge of your headlights that doesn't belong there, don't stop. Don't stare. Don't follow. Keep your hands on the wheel, your eyes on the asphalt, and your faith wherever you keep it. Because out there, in the silence between towns, the road has its own rules. And the things that live in that silence have been there far longer than any of us. If these stories got under your skin the way they got under mine, hit that like button right now and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Drop in the comments which story shook you the most. And share this with someone who thinks they don't believe in any of this. Let's see how long that lasts.